Hey friends, great to see you back again to our See the Light, Yes You Can Draw club meetings. This is meeting number 24. I'm Pat Nepley, your master artist. I'll be with you through all of these meetings, and I'm so glad that we get to be together to really understand what it takes to be a great artist, learning how to draw. So the last time we were together, we talked about form. Form is a 3D version of shape. And so if you have a circle, the form is the sphere. If you have a square, the form is the cube. We're going to be talking about form today and about texture, which we talked about a few meetings ago, and how you combine form and texture in order to make your drawings more realistic. If you were getting ready to draw something with fur, it would be very complicated. Let's just say a rabbit. And you would need to spend a lot of time observing the form of the rabbit and the value and the texture. Take a look at this piece of artwork from a famous German artist, Albrecht Dürer. This artist was very mindful of form and the correct texture so the fur would look just right. He paid careful attention to every little detail. This is a very realistic looking rabbit. And it's all of those art elements combining that make this such a great piece of art. So let's review what you need for today's club meeting. You'll need a few sheets of paper. Any size is fine. I'm going to be using something other than white, but you can use white. You'll need your standard pencil, your number 2 is fine, and a softer pencil, a really good eraser, a Sharpie marker, a finer black pen, and you're going to need some things you'll find in the produce aisle. An orange, an onion, and a coconut. Isn't that fun that you can actually go to the grocery store and find some great things to draw? Now, if you've been with us through these club meetings, you know that we've drawn some apples and some pears. Fruit are always great to draw. Today, we're going to be really mixing it up with fruits and vegetables, and they have something in common. They have a similar form. If we use the idea of a sphere as our base form, I were to look at our 3 objects, they all would start with the form of a sphere and just be slightly different. But the main difference we notice is the difference in their texture. So we're going to delineate the form with the texture in today's meeting. And I'm so excited to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is take our regular pencil and, drawing lightly, you're going to draw 3 circles. Now, these don't have to be perfect circles. You don't need to trace because we're not going to keep them as circles. We're going to really define the form because, truthfully, an orange is not a perfect sphere, nor is an onion or a coconut. So let me show you. Here I've done an orange and an onion. And you see that their shapes are similar, but because their texture is so different, that's what tells me this is an orange, but this is an onion. So if I move on and I start on this particular piece of paper, I'm just going to very lightly draw 2 circles. That's my starting point. But let's start with the orange. The orange is mostly spherical. It's probably the closest of all of them. But if I spend some time carefully observing, I'll see that it's actually not totally spherical. It kind of flattens out in spots or bulges in others. So you look at the orange that you have and you'll know what the exact shape is. When we did our contour line drawings at one of our early club meetings, we talked about how important it is for careful observation. Spend time looking at your object with your eyes before you ever put the pencil to the paper. And after you carefully observe, then you notice all the little details that you can draw in to make your drawing even better. So for this orange, I see that it has a stem or a navel, and I want to make sure I put that in. I'm going to have my orange go this way. And so I'll use a few little lines to suggest the top of that orange. So once I have the form right, I can move on to the other key aspects, value and texture. You don't want to start on some heavy texture until you're sure you have form right. So, once I know I have the form just like I want, I erase the extra lines. And now I can start with my value and my texture. Do you remember when we shaded a sphere for value, we talked about the importance of knowing where your light source is and having the value gradually change as the light moves around the sphere. Same thing works for an orange. First thing I noticed though is this orange has really interesting skin. It's like little indentations or pits. I don't want to get too confused right now. I just want to work with value, and then we'll add that skin texture as our last step. So just like when we shaded a sphere, very quickly I want to shade. But in order to make this look like an orange, I'm really going to focus on adding in some value on the edges. I'll explain why in a minute. I have my hand in the overhand grip, but I'm far away from my pencil point so that I can stay nice and light. And now I'm going to blend. Up by where my stem of the orange used to be, this was attached to a tree by a stem. There's indentations there, so I know that there's darker values there where the indentation occurred. Now remember I said that the skin of the orange is what makes it so unique that you know that that's what that fruit is. It's actually like little tiny dashes, little tiny indentations. And so with the very fine tip of my pencil in my basic grip, I'm going to start at the edge and I'm going to make very small, almost like little smiles, but very light and very small. Now you might think that I'm going to make them darker at the edges where my value shading is, but actually you're going to do something different. Where you've left mostly the paper, the lightest part of the orange, that's where you're going to actually apply a little more pressure and your dashes will be darker. And the reason is because that's where the light is the strongest on that part of the orange, and so the shadows cast by those little indentations is darker. So I will add some darker of these little indentation dashes. Now I'll make them on the edge too, but I don't need to get lighter in the center. But I'm not going to cover the entire surface with these little dashes. That would just be too much. In order to show the texture, I simply suggest part of the texture and part of the surface. So make your little dashes, the indentation of the skin of the orange, on the edges, and a little bit coming into the center, but not over the whole thing. If you go back and you look at the one that I did earlier, you see that I have a combination of value changes and the texture of the indentations and the lines of where the stem was to suggest the overall form. So you know that that is an orange. Now what about our onion? That's quite different from an orange, but it's still a spherical shape. Well, if I were to carefully observe, which is what we always do, I notice that kind of comes up to a little bit more of a point at the top of my onion. This is where the stem was, and the other side is where the roots were. And so the bottom and the top of the onion come to somewhat of a point, whereas it's rounder at the center. The other thing I notice in terms of the texture of the onion, it's many layers of this thin, papery skin. So the first thing I want to do is get my form right before I move on to value or texture. So I'll leave the widest part the same, but then I'll come up and give it kind of a little pointy top there. And then coming down to the bottom where the roots were, kind of points again. So it's kind of like a sphere that has a point at the top. This is where the stalk was of the onion plant, and then the bottom is where the roots came. And then erase my extra lines. So now that my form is right, I want to put in value. Again, using the idea of a sphere, the value changes have to be gradual as it goes around. And because this comes kind of to a point at the top and the bottom, that's where the values will be darkest. So I'm going to shade just ever so slightly, heading to the top and the bottom, where the onion kind of comes in and becomes narrower. And it's a rounded object, so the edges will be darker, and as the light moves around, it stays light in the middle. Now, I look at the papery skin of the onion, and the main thing I notice about the texture is there's very, very fine lines that run vertically from top to bottom over the entire onion. Well, in order to do that, I need a very sharp pencil, and I'm only going to use the point. And I'm going to make those lines, but I'm not going to make them complete lines. I'm actually going to make them what we call a broken line. In other words, almost like dashes for part of the line, going from the whole onion. So let's start in the center and just very lightly make a broken line down to the bottom. But because it is a curved object, not straight, those lines will start to curve in the direction of the edge. So this edge bulges to the left, so these lines now will start to curve to the left. So they're vertical lines, very fine, that bulge to the left. Now when I'm on this side, the very thin lines in the skin of the onion will now bulge to the right. So you have to make sure that lines are curving to the right. I also notice that there's some skin that's loose and away from the surface of my onion. Look. Onion skin is so thin that it often peels away from the onion itself very easily. So to help show that, some of my onion skin will be away from the surface. You might even see where it's starting to break away. Here were some little roots coming down, pieces of skin. By using fine lines, I can show that this is an onion. So even though the form of an orange and an onion are very similar, by spending time getting the right texture, we're showing exactly what it is. Very different objects. Now what about something like a coconut? Ha! The first thing you notice about the coconut is it's got great texture. It's brown and hairy. So I don't know that I want to use something as delicate as a pencil to show the coconut, because this is a coarse, rough texture. Again, if you were with us one of the previous club meetings, you know that it's important to choose the right tool for the texture that you want. So for my coconut, I'm going to use a Sharpie marker. And here, the form is defined by the texture and the value. You'll notice I have a lot of Sharpie lines at the edges where I want the value to be darker to show that the form goes around, it's spherical. But I didn't do as many hairs of the coconut in the center, even though it's a hairy coconut all the way around, because that's a lighter value. Harder to see the texture than where there's a lot of shadows cast. So again, I chose the right tool. I combined value, darker, against light, and the hairy texture so that you know this is not an orange, and it's not an onion, but it's a coconut. So I want you to spend some time before we meet again to pay careful attention to the textures of forms around you. Some things are going to be very smooth, others are going to be very rough. But by spending time observing the details, then you can become a better artist as you use texture to define the form. Now, what we've done has been black and white, but you don't have to have black and white to define texture. Sometimes you can use color. Here's an example. Here's tree bark. This very quick sketch is done in pastel, but it's still the change in value from the light gold to a tan to a dark brown. The change in value is what defines the texture. Light against dark and the different kinds of marks. You can get the same effect in color. So experiment with pastels or even colored pencils to get texture using color. When I look at this rough bark, it makes me think of a passage in Scripture where when you think of rough, it's hard to think of things when you're talking about Jesus that are rough, because Jesus was not a rough man. But I remember when we were all waiting for Jesus to arrive, his cousin, John the Baptist, was trying to prepare the people for when Jesus would come. So there's a great portion in Scripture. Let me get my Bible. It's in Luke. And Luke was talking about what the prophet Isaiah said in the Old Testament. And it came true in the words of John the Baptist. Luke 3:4-6 says, "As is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Every valley shall be filled in, every mountain and hill made low. The crooked roads will become straight, and the rough ways smooth. But all mankind will see God's salvation." Wow, what a great promise. That was trying to get the people ready, saying, you know what, we want everything to be great for when Jesus comes. He will be the one who will take the rough paths and make them smooth. He will take hills and level them out. He can do anything he wants. He can make our crooked ways that we travel as humans, he can make them straight. That's a great promise. I hope you know Jesus and the great promises he has for you that you can find in the Bible. Well, friends, we're out of time, and that means we've got to sign off. But I know you'll come back again to see what else we're going to learn where you can be a great artist. Because, yes, you can draw. I can't wait to see you next time. Bye-bye.